Video game remakes usually bring mixed reviews and opinions. Once a game franchise starts to remake their old titles, fans will inevitably start waiting or campaigning for their favourite entry to be adapted for a modern system. Remakes give game developers the chance to refine old mechanics due to advances in technology, and repackage a hit story for a new audience. Characters and scenery also get a facelift as newer game systems have better resolution and more ability to add details to the world. But despite their prevalence within fandom discourse, remakes often get a mixed reception once they're released. Some remakes are beloved by fans, being seen as improved or even definitive versions of the game that they're based on, whereas other remakes can be seen as failures that are either not better or potentially worse than the original, and therefore not worth your time and money. Different fans ultimately want different things from remakes, but I would probably describe a good remake as a faithful upgrade. It updates the mechanics and the art of the original to create a more fun or user-friendly play experience without compromising the essence of the original in the process. A little bit of extra content, new chapters, side quests, characters, they all don't go amiss. Remakes are also a common topic of conversation within the Fire Emblem community. Fire Emblem has 17 main series games, and 3 of those are remakes of the first 3 titles. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon for the DS, Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem, and Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. A big question within the fandom has been when the Fire Emblem team will be releasing another remake, which game they'll choose and what that remake should or shouldn't include. The likelihood of each game's remake is a popular topic of conversation, but I don't want to go over that today. Ultimately, we can make conclusions based on our own predictions and attempts to guess at developer logic, but we won't know what game is being remade until it's announced. Instead of trying to predict the future, what I want to do today is go through the games which I think are the least and most deserving of remakes, not necessarily which games that I think will get a remake in the near future. I'll also be talking a little bit about how I would want some of these games to be updated if they did get a remake. These rankings have been decided solely based on my opinion, so if you disagree with my list, then let me know in the comments what you think should be the next Fire Emblem game to get made into a remake. Let's get into it. Number 13, Fire Emblem Three Houses. Three Houses is the second most recent main series game. It was wildly successful and millions of copies were sold worldwide, and then we even got a spin-off game with Fire Emblem Warriors Three Hopes. Three Houses is still popular 6 years down the line, and just to keep that hype up, we're also getting Fortune's Weave this year, which seems to have some returning mechanics and at least one returning character. The Fodlan buzz is still very much alive with us in 2026, and for that reason I don't think we need a remake of Three Houses anytime soon. Let's focus our attention instead on some other titles in the franchise that could do with the remake treatment. Number 12, Fire Emblem Gaiden. Fire Emblem Gaiden's remake, Shadows of Valentia, was the last Fire Emblem game to be released on the 3DS. Originally, people thought that the Echoes subtitle was going to kickstart a series of remakes, all with the Echoes label attached, though we've yet to see that happen. SOV was a relatively decent remake, bringing the 1992 game into the modern gaming world. It also added extra details to the story and linked in with Awakening, giving players a better understanding of how the Fire Emblem world works. Even though the game is now nearly 9 years old, it's still the third most recent main series game in the franchise and the most recent remake. There was a 25-year period in between Gaiden and SOV, so I don't think we need another remake when not even a decade has passed since the last one. Number 11, Fire Emblem Engage. You might have expected Engage to be at the bottom of the list, given that it's the most recent release in the franchise. And part of that is personal opinion. I like Engage more than Three Houses and Gaiden, but I also think that the world of Engage hasn't been utilised as much as Fodlan or Valentia. However, I do think that this would be better explored in the form of a sequel than a remake. I'd like for a game to visit some of the unexplored parts of Elyos or beyond, like Kagetsu's homeland. It would also be cool to see how the world of Engage is doing 50, 70, 100 years down the line, when only Vale or Aaliyah are left from the Engage army. If we are talking remakes though, I do think that Engage will eventually deserve a remake, but I also think we probably need to have quite a few mainline games in between before that happens so that we aren't using the same 12 emblems as the original. Overall, a remake could be deserved in the future, but for now I would much rather have a sequel than a remake. Number 10, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon for the DS is often thought of as Fire Emblem's first attempt at remaking a mainline game, and it is a pretty decent game, but it isn't actually the first time that the story of FE1 has been remade. We also got a version of FE1, albeit a slightly shorter one, in Fire Emblem 3, Mystery of the Emblem. This game was split into 2 parts, a remake of FE1 followed by a sequel story. I don't think I would be mad if we got another remake of Fire Emblem 1. It is the story that started the franchise and the last retelling came out nearly 18 years ago, but ultimately I don't think we're really short on remakes on the war with Medius. I would much rather see some of the other entries in the franchise get a first remake rather than FE1 getting a third. Number 9, Fire Emblem Awakening. Awakening is now more than a decade old. It also has lots of links with other titles in the series, taking place in the same part of the world as Marth and Celica's games, and having some form of link to Ike and the character of Priam. It's also called the game that saved the franchise due to its popularity and its role in keeping Fire Emblem around as a franchise. But with all of that being said, I don't think Awakening really needs a remake. Being released in the early 2010s, around the start of what's considered the modern era of Fire Emblem, a remake of Awakening likely wouldn't have that much to offer. The game still plays really well today, and there haven't really been that many advancements in how Fire Emblem works to justify a revamp in the same way that we had for Fire Emblems 1 to 3. It's also still pretty accessible. You can always find a copy online or in a second-hand game shop, and there isn't really much else to say beyond that. I'm sure I'd like to see a remake one day, just not anytime soon. Number 8. Fire Emblem Fates. Fates was a really popular game, but for the same reasons as Awakening, I don't think it needs a remake. It's not old enough to benefit from a remake, and it's still accessible for those who want to try it. The main motivating factor now for a remake over Awakening would be that it's hard to find a legal copy of Revelations given that the 3DS online store is now no longer running. But that might be a hard sell for fans who can easily play Birthright or Conquest or turn to other methods to play the third route. I just hope that if they do remake Fates a few years or decades down the line, they choose to make all 3 paths available in one copy instead of making us pay for the entire thing 3 times. I'd even be willing to pay a little bit extra to avoid that. For right now though, I don't think I could be enticed to pick up a remake of what's still a relatively new game in the series history. Number 7. Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. This placement feels pretty high up considering that Mystery of the Emblem has already been remade in 2010, but I do think FE3 deserves another remake. New Mystery of the Emblem was never released outside of Japan due to fears that it wouldn't perform well, meaning that audiences outside of Japan may have never experienced the story of FE3. Even with patches that can translate the story though, FE12 just doesn't feel like the best representative for Mystery of the Emblem. Cutting it off from the original story of Shadow Dragon and adding in a new avatar character made it feel like it was a half of a bigger whole, which made it weaker as a game in its own right. I think that a remake of this game should be structured more like FE3 than FE12, being split into 2 books that cover the story of Shadow Dragon and New Mystery respectively. I would also prefer this a lot more to remaking either story on its own. I don't particularly think an Arcanea remake is anywhere near the horizon for us, but should it ever be a possibility, then I hope that the game developers take this approach and give us both stories in one package. Number 6. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. I'm including these 2 games together because I would personally like to see a remake that includes both games in one. This is definitely ambitious, but I think it could be justified if they cut out some filler chapters like they did in FE3, and potentially made it a little more expensive by marketing it as 2 games in one. Path of Radiance has been made accessible through Nintendo Switch Online, so the need for a remake of FE9 has definitely dipped. But Radiant Dawn is still one of my favourite Fire Emblem games, and I don't think you would be able to remake it without doing Path of Radiance first. Although both games still play well, they're both super expensive if you want a physical copy, so I think it would be great to see them with a new coat of paint through a remake. But for now, I'll still be happy if we can just get Radiant Dawn on Nintendo Switch Online. Number 5. Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade. Fire Emblem 7 isn't my favourite game by any stretch, but I do think it's more than reasonable to ask for a remake of the oldest Fire Emblem game to have been released worldwide. For Western audiences, this was many people's first Fire Emblem game, and that maybe feels a little bit more marketable than a story that many fans have barely even heard of. I'm not as excited about the concept of an FE7 remake, but if we were to get one, then I would want to see them do something with Lin mode to make it more compelling to play. At the minute, Lin mode feels a little bit like a chore, but it can also help to play it if you want to take any of its characters into the later game. It's also a mode that everyone has to play at least once, so they should try to make it more enjoyable for both new and experienced players. It is 10 chapters after all. It would also be good to see if they can fix the weather mechanic that they tried to make work but ultimately just made levels less fun. Overall, it wouldn't be my top choice, but I can't argue with the fact that it would probably be a good choice for a remake. Number 4. Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. Out of the 2 Alib games, Binding Blade should definitely take precedence over the Blazing Blade since it's one of the Japan exclusive releases. FE6 seems to be well liked within the Fire Emblem fandom, and I think it would take well to modern Fire Emblem, especially since the GBA games are relatively simplistic in design, so it would be hard to mess up. And there's also room to try a new mechanic or 2 without interfering with the base game. If we are going to remake this game, then the main thing I would want would be for the game to be more explicit about the need to have all the divine weapons to get the true ending, as well as actual hints before each chapter about who you need to deploy to access the paralogs where you get said weapons. A bit like FE7, I don't particularly love FE6 in its current state, but I would actually be pretty happy to see a modern take on this game if it were to be announced. Number 3. Fire Emblem Sacred Stones. Now, me putting this game above Binding Blade is definitely a product of bias. Sacred Stones is one of my favourite Fire Emblem games, whereas FE6 is not, but I do genuinely think Sacred Stones does deserve a remake. Similar to FE6, Sacred Stones is relatively simplistic in comparison to some other Fire Emblem titles, which means that it would be relatively hard to mess up. I also think that there's a lot of potential for new characters and chapters in a remake of FE8, given the route split halfway through and the relatively low number of chapters in a playthrough. I definitely think that a remake would benefit from a little bit of extra content to make it worthwhile. It would also make the version more distinct and the remake more justifiable. Sacred Stones seems to be a favourite of the fandom. A lot of people have soft spots for the world of Magvel, so a remake could be appealing to fans who don't want to pay for Nintendo Switch Online or are more comfortable with modern Fire Emblem mechanics. I love route splits, so even though I don't think this game is likely to be remade, I would be over the moon to see a revamp of Sacred Stones. Number 2. Fire Emblem Thracia. Thracia is actually my least favourite Fire Emblem game, but that opinion is solely because I find it really difficult, to the point where I've never actually completed a run, even with Paragon mode and save scumming. Yes, I am that bad at Fire Emblem. The main word I would use to describe Thracia is frustrating. Not just because it's hard, but because I know that I should love this game. Thracia is a really unique game with interesting mechanics like fatigue, follow-up crits, and stealing your weapon and funds from enemy units. The fatigue mechanic is something that I really like because you can't just rely on the same units every level, you have to switch them out. The story of the game also seems amazing, but typically when I play it, I become so impatient from struggling through a chapter that I often end up skipping through the dialogue. I think honestly what I dislike so much about Thracia is that my skill level is stopping me from loving it as much as I should. All of that, coupled with the fact that it's a Japan exclusive game, makes it really deserving of a remake in my mind. If Thracia was to be remade, I would want to see it kept relatively the same in terms of story, characters and mechanics, but I would also like to see some adaptations to make it more user-friendly, such as casual mode or varying difficulties. This would allow us to get the experience of Thracia without locking new, or in my case, experienced but stupid players out of the fun. I think people often act as if a Thracia remake wouldn't make sense without the context of FE4, but I honestly disagree. The game provides plenty of context about why Leif is in the situation he's in without the need to release another game before it. But it would definitely help though, which brings us on to Number 1. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. This one shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who has spent enough time on Fire Emblem YouTube. FE4 is the next game in line for a remake if we're going from start to finish, but it's also a really well loved game within the fandom and one of my personal favourites. An FE4 remake has been speculated for years, with any new releases into the series being scrutinised for potential clues that the fabled Jug Drill remake is around the corner. I don't put a lot of stock into these theories. I'm not sure how much the game devs will be able to trust the profitability of a game where so many fundamental mechanics are different to what fans are used to. But I also think that's part of the appeal of Genealogy. It's unlike any other Fire Emblem game and one of the best stories as well. If we were to ever get a Genealogy remake, I would definitely want to see how the characters and maps are adapted to a modern art style. I would also love to get a refined version of the marriage and children mechanic, so that you have a little bit more control over your character pairings, and one of your female units doesn't just randomly get married to Alec in chapter 4 and ruin your plans for her kids. Genealogy is 30 years old this year, and so a remake of the game feels well overdue, and I know if a remake were to be announced, a lot of us fans would be lining up to pre-order it. So that's my opinion on which Fire Emblem games are most deserving of the remake treatment. Fire Emblem has grown so much as a franchise since its first release back in 1990, and yet so many of their titles are only available in certain parts of the world. I genuinely love remakes, even the ones that aren't particularly loved by other fans, and I would love for more Fire Emblem titles to be brought into the modern day for more people to experience. Let me know in the comments what games you would like to see remade, and what you would want those games to look like. And if you like videos about Fire Emblem, then subscribe. I put out a new video every second Sunday, and I'm really excited to share some of my upcoming videos with you all. Until next time, take care.